Some loves are written in ice, waiting centuries to thaw. The wind howls across the Lofoten Islands like the breath of ancient gods, carrying secrets that modern science refuses to acknowledge. Dr. Marcus Thornfield kneels beside an excavation site where permafrost has surrendered a treasure that defies every law of preservation he's studied in 20 years of archaeology. She lies there, this Viking woman, as if she'd fallen asleep yesterday rather than a millennium ago, auburn braids still gleaming, skin pale as moonlight, lips curved in what almost looks like a smile of recognition. Marcus knows he's lost his mind when he leans down and presses his mouth to hers, tasting winter and something impossibly familiar. His team thinks grief over his daughter's death has finally broken him. They're wrong. He's not broken, he's remembering. When those violet eyes open and she whispers, "You found me, my love," Marcus realizes that some promises echo across lifetimes, and some debts can only be paid in another age. But why does she remember everything, while he remembers only fragments? And what Viking curse could bind two souls across 1,000 years of separation? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The violet eyes that stare up at Marcus hold the weight of centuries, and yet they focus on him with an intimacy that makes his breath catch. Around them, the excavation site has gone silent except for the wind's relentless howl. His team, Dr. Sarah Chen, graduate students Miller and Johansson and their Norwegian guide Eric, stand frozen in a tableau of academic shock and human disbelief. "Professor?" Sarah's voice cuts through the Arctic air, sharp with concern. She's been his research partner for 8 years, has seen him through Emma's diagnosis, the failed treatments, the funeral that left him hollow as driftwood. "Marcus, step away from the body." But the woman beneath him isn't a body anymore, is she? Her chest rises and falls with breath that should be impossible. When she speaks again, her voice carries the lilt of Old Norse woven through modern English, as if languages are merely costumes she can change at will. "The ice preserved me for you," she whispers, her hand, impossibly warm, reaching up to touch his face. "But you look older, Marcus. More weathered by grief." Marcus. No one has called him that since when? The name resonates in his bones like a struck bell, awakening something that feels less like memory and more like a wound that never properly healed. This isn't possible. Miller stumbles backward, his camera forgotten in the snow. The kid's been documenting their finds for weeks, cataloguing every shard of pottery, every fragment of bone. But there's no category in archaeological taxonomy for the impossible. Marcus helps the woman, Astrid, though he doesn't remember learning her name, sit up among the melting ice. She moves with fluid grace, as if waking from any ordinary sleep rather than emerging from a millennium of frozen death. Her burial shroud, intricately woven with symbols that make his vision blur when he looks at them directly, clings to her form like shadow made substantial. "The permafrost," Sarah says, her scientific mind grasping for rational explanations. "The unusual warmth this season, the rapid thaw, maybe some kind of preservation process we don't understand yet. Suspended animation like those tardigrades that—" "No." Astrid's voice carries absolute authority as she looks around the excavation site, taking in the modern equipment, the GPS markers, the generator humming in the distance. "This is not your science, Dr. Chen. Though I appreciate your loyalty to Marcus through his darkest hours." The casual use of Sarah's name and title sends a chill down Marcus's spine that has nothing to do with the Arctic wind. Astrid speaks as if she's watched them all from some impossible distance, cataloguing their lives with the same precision they've applied to cataloguing her burial site. "How do you know us?" Eric, their guide, steps forward with the wariness of a man whose grandfather's stories suddenly seem less like folklore and more like warnings. His hand drifts unconsciously to the iron pendant at his throat. Astrid rises to her feet with Marcus's help, and he's struck by how perfectly she fits against his side, as if his body has muscle memory of holding her. The thought should terrify him more than it does. I know you because love leaves echoes, she says simply, and some echoes grow loud enough to wake the dead. Her gaze finds Marcus again, and in those violet depths he sees flashes of things that can't be memories. Firelight dancing across carved wooden walls, the taste of mead and honey, the weight of a sword in his hand as raiders crest a distant hill. Emma, he whispers, the name of his daughter torn from his throat like a prayer. I dreamed you told me how to save Emma, but I was too late. I'm always too late. Yes, Astrid says, and her acknowledgement of his impossible statement sends ice through his veins. You failed to save our daughter then, as you failed to save your daughter now. The pattern repeats, Marcus, until we choose to break it. Our daughter. The words hit him like physical blows. In his dreams of ancient Norway there had always been a child with Emma's laugh and Astrid's eyes, a little girl who died screaming as Viking raiders burned their village. Dreams that felt too real, too specific, too painful to be mere grief-induced fantasy. This is insane, Johansson mutters, but he's filming with his phone, some instinct telling him he's witnessing something that will rewrite textbooks, if anyone ever believes the footage. Marcus looks at his team, these people who've followed him to the edge of the world in pursuit of artifacts and answers, and realizes their expedition has just crossed the boundary between archaeology and something far more dangerous. Behind them, the October sun hangs low and strange in the Arctic sky, casting everything in shades of amber and gold that make the world look like it's burning. What do you want from me? He asks Astrid, though part of him already knows the answer will change everything. She smiles then, and it's beautiful and terrible as the aurora borealis. I want you to remember, my love, and then I want you to choose. The world tilts on its axis as Astrid's words hang in the Arctic air like smoke. Marcus feels the weight of 5 pairs of eyes on him, his team waiting for their expedition leader to provide some rational explanation for the impossible woman standing in their excavation site, speaking of love and choices and patterns that span lifetimes. Remember what? The question scrapes from his throat, though part of him fears the answer more than the silence that stretches between them like a chasm. Astrid steps closer, her bare feet somehow unaffected by the frozen ground that has numbed his extremities even through thermal boots. When she reaches up to touch his face again, her fingertips trace the lines carved by 2 years of sleepless nights and guilt that sits in his chest like a stone. Your life before this one. The village by the fjord. The way you sang to our daughter when storms frightened her. Her voice drops to a whisper that somehow carries perfectly in the wind. The way you held me as I died, promising you would find a way to save us both. The images crash through his mind with the force of a tidal wave. Not the hazy fragments of dreams he's dismissed for years, but crystal clear memories of another existence. A life where he was called Marcus the Scholar, where he studied the old ways and tried to prepare his people for the raiders that swept down from the north like wolves, where he failed anyway. Professor Thornfield. Sarah's voice cuts through the vision, sharp with professional concern. You need to step away from the subject. We need to establish protocols, document everything properly. This discovery, whatever she is, it's going to change everything we know about preservation, about the nature of consciousness itself, Miller interrupts, his academic excitement warring with obvious terror. If this is real, if she's actually been conscious during preservation, the implications for thanatology alone. Stop. Marcus's command silences them both. He looks at his team, really looks at them for the first time since Astrid opened her eyes. Sarah Chen, brilliant and loyal, who held his hand at Emma's funeral when his ex-wife couldn't bear to look at him. Miller and Johansson, graduate students who'd followed him to the Arctic because they believed in his theories about Viking settlement patterns. Eric, their guide, whose weathered face now carries the pale cast of a man witnessing something his ancestral memories warned him to fear. These people have trusted him. They've followed him to this remote fjord because his reputation, built over 20 years of methodical research, gave weight to his conviction that something significant lay buried here. Now that reputation hangs by a thread as thin as spider silk, and their careers, their futures, hang with it. You have a choice too, Astrid says, as if reading his thoughts. All of you do. You can walk away from this excavation, return to your universities, and pretend you found nothing but empty ice. Your ordinary lives await. Your lectures, your papers, your careful cataloguing of the safely dead. The words carry no malice, but they sting anyway. Because isn't that exactly what his life had become? A careful cataloguing of the safely dead, while he failed spectacularly at protecting the living. Emma's medical bills had consumed his savings, his marriage, his peace. The experimental treatments he'd fought for had only prolonged her suffering. In the end, she died anyway, leaving him with nothing but the echo of her voice asking why Daddy couldn't make the pain stop. What's the alternative? He asks, though he knows the question commits him to a path his team might not be able to follow. Astrid's smile turns sad and knowing. You remember who you were before grief made you small. You helped me break a pattern that has claimed too many lives across too many centuries. She looks at each member of his team in turn. But first, you all return to camp. You think. You decide if you can bear to know the truth about what lies beneath the ordinary world you've built around yourselves. We can't just leave you here, Sarah protests. You're not wearing proper cold weather gear. You'll freeze to death. The laugh that escapes Astrid carries harmonics like wind chimes made of ice. Death is not the end you believe it to be, Dr. Chen. I have been dead for nearly 1,000 years, and yet here I stand. She touches the carved bone pendant at her throat, and for a moment, the symbols etched into it seem to shift and writhe in the amber light. The cold cannot claim me, any more than time can erase what we've shared. Marcus feels the weight of leadership settle on his shoulders like a familiar burden. His team needs direction, normalcy, some anchor point in a situation that has blown past all established parameters. But beneath that responsibility, something else stirs. A hunger he'd thought died with Emma, a desperate need to believe that loss isn't final, that love might indeed echo across impossible distances. Pack up the site, he tells them, his voice steadier than he feels. We return to base camp. Tomorrow we decide what this means. As his team begins to move with the automatic efficiency of long practice, Marcus allows himself one last look at Astrid. She watches him with those violet eyes, patient as geology, certain as gravity, waiting for him to choose. The walk back to base camp stretches like a funeral march across the tundra. Marcus leads his team through the maze of equipment stations and GPS markers, each footstep crunching against permafrost that seems less permanent with every passing hour. Behind them, the excavation site lies abandoned, though he can feel Astrid's presence there like a magnetic pull against his spine. No one speaks. The silence has weight, pressing down on them with the authority of shared trauma. Sarah walks beside him, her face set in the expression she wore during Emma's final weeks. Professional composure barely containing personal anguish. Miller and Johansson follow like sleepwalkers, their cameras and tablets forgotten in favor of simply putting one foot in front of the other. Eric brings up the rear, muttering what might be prayers in Norwegian. The base camp emerges from the October gloom like a cluster of modern artifacts, prefab structures and generators humming against the vast emptiness of the Arctic landscape. The contrast feels absurd now, this careful arrangement of civilization perched on the edge of something that has just revealed the inadequacy of everything Marcus thought he understood about the world. Equipment check, Sarah announces as they reach the main shelter, falling back on protocol like a lifeline. Everything needs to be secured and catalogued before we discuss whatever just happened, but Marcus can see the tremor in her hands as she reaches for her field notebook. Sarah Chen, who has faced down university review boards and hostile peer reviewers with the calm authority of someone who trusts empirical evidence above all else, is struggling to maintain her equilibrium. They all are. Professor, Miller's voice cracks slightly. Should we contact the university, the Norwegian authorities? This kind of discovery. He gestures helplessly toward the excavation site, though Astrid is no longer visible through the Arctic haze. What discovery? Marcus asks quietly. A perfectly preserved body that showed signs of life? They'll assume equipment malfunction, hallucination brought on by isolation and cold. Our funding gets pulled, our reputations get shredded, and we all end up teaching intro courses at community colleges. The brutal practicality of it settles over them like a shroud. Marcus has spent 2 decades building credibility in a field where wild theories are career suicide. The Viking settlement patterns he came here to document are controversial enough. Claims about impossibly preserved women who speak with intimate knowledge of modern researchers would destroy everything he's worked for. But if it's real, Johansson whispers, if she's actually what she appears to be, we're talking about the discovery of the century, maybe the millennium. And if it's not? Eric speaks for the first time since leaving the site, his English careful and deliberate. My grandfather told stories about the old burial grounds, about things that should stay buried. He said the ice keeps certain hungers sleeping, and warm years wake them up. Marcus feels the weight of decision settling around him like pack ice. His team is looking to him for leadership, for some way to process what they've witnessed. Sarah's loyalty has carried them through 8 years of academic partnership, but this pushes beyond the boundaries of any relationship built on shared scholarship. The graduate students' futures hang in the balance. Association with something this far outside accepted parameters could destroy their careers before they truly begin. Then there's the deeper current running beneath these practical considerations. The way Astrid spoke his name, Marcus, with the familiarity of someone who had whispered it in moments of love and terror, the flash of memories that felt more real than his actual childhood, more vivid than his marriage to Rebecca, more immediate than the 20 years he'd spent building his identity as Dr. Marcus Thornfield. In those memories, he sees a man who studied ancient texts by firelight, who tried desperately to prepare his village for raids that came anyway. A man who watched his daughter die screaming while raiders burned everything he'd tried to protect. A man who failed, as Marcus Thornfield had failed, to save what mattered most. The pattern repeats, Astrid had said, until we choose to break it. We're not contacting anyone tonight, Marcus decides, his voice cutting through the shelter's recycled air. We secure the site, we review our documentation, and we sleep on this. Tomorrow morning we make a choice. Sarah nods slowly, though her expression suggests she's already calculating the professional risks. What kind of choice? Marcus looks out through the shelter's small window toward the excavation site, where Astrid waits with the patience of someone who has already been dead for 1,000 years. The October sun hangs impossibly low on the horizon, casting everything in shades of gold and amber that make the world look like it's caught between seasons, between realities. Whether we're archaeologists documenting the safely dead, he says, echoing Astrid's words, or whether we're something else entirely. The generator hums in the silence that follows, a mechanical heartbeat in the vast emptiness of the Arctic night. And somewhere in that silence, Marcus hears the echo of a choice that will determine not just his future, but the futures of everyone who has trusted him enough to follow him to the edge of the world. The generator's steady hum becomes a metronome marking the longest night of Marcus's life. He lies in his sleeping bag, staring at the prefab ceiling, while his team settles into restless sleep around him. Sarah's breathing carries the irregular rhythm of someone wrestling with nightmares. Miller mutters mathematical equations in his sleep, something about carbon dating anomalies that his subconscious refuses to accept. Even Eric, who usually sleeps like the dead after decades of Arctic guiding, tosses and turns with the agitation of a man whose ancestral warnings have proven prophetic. Marcus gives up on sleep at 3 a.m., padding quietly to the shelter, small kitchenette, to brew coffee that tastes like bitter salvation. Through the window he can see the excavation site glowing under their security lights, a rectangle of artificial day carved from the polar night. He knows Astrid is still there, waiting with the patience of geological time, but from this distance she might be nothing more than tricks of light and shadow. Might be. The phrase sits in his mind like a splinter. 20 years of archaeological training demand he apply Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is usually correct. Isolation psychosis, group hallucination triggered by the unusual weather patterns and the stress of their remote location, equipment malfunction that made their instruments register impossible readings, a perfectly preserved body, remarkable but not supernatural, that his grief-addled mind has transformed into something magical. But then he touches his lips and remembers the moment before everything changed. The kiss he pressed to frozen flesh in a moment of profound loneliness, believing he was saying goodbye to another beautiful thing that death had claimed. The absolute certainty that this woman's face belonged in his memories, even though he'd never seen it before. The way her eyes opened with recognition rather than confusion, as if she'd been waiting specifically for him to find her. "Can't sleep either?" Sarah's voice startles him from his reverie. She emerges from her sleeping area wearing thermal gear and the expression of someone who's spent hours staring at problems that don't add up. "The data doesn't make sense," Marcus admits, pouring her coffee. Carbon dating put the burial site at approximately 1000 CE. The preservation is consistent with permafrost conditions, but the bone density readings, the cellular structure, Sarah, those scans suggest active biological processes. I've run the numbers 16 times. Her scientific precision cracks slightly. The electromagnetic signatures alone should be impossible. Dead tissue doesn't generate that kind of field variance. And her response to thermal imaging, Marcus, her core temperature was reading normal human ranges within minutes of exposure to air. They stand together in the shelter's artificial warmth. Two academics trying to apply rational frameworks to something that has shattered the boundaries of their shared reality. Outside, the Arctic wind howls with the voice of something ancient and hungry, and Marcus finds himself thinking about Eric's grandfather's warnings, about things that should stay buried. "There's another problem," Sarah continues quietly. "The way she spoke to each of us. She knew details about Emma's treatment that I've never shared with anyone. Miller's dissertation topic, Johansson's research into thanatology. She called you by a name that doesn't appear in any of your documentation. The name Marcus echoes in his memory, with the weight of identity itself. Not the childhood nickname his mother used, not the professional abbreviation some colleagues preferred, something deeper, a name that belongs to memories of a life spent preparing for disasters he couldn't prevent, loving people he couldn't save. What if we're approaching this backwards?" Marcus sets down his coffee, the liquid suddenly too bitter to swallow. What if the question isn't how she knows these things, but why we're the ones who found her? Meaning, you said it yourself, the equipment readings suggested we'd find something significant here before we ever broke ground. My theories about Viking settlement patterns led us to this specific fjord, this exact burial site. We've been working toward this moment for 8 months, Sarah. What if that wasn't coincidence? The implications hang between them like a live wire. If Astrid's claims about recurring patterns hold any truth, then their entire expedition might be less about archaeological discovery and more about some cosmic debt coming due. The thought should terrify him, but instead Marcus feels something that resembles relief. Because if love can indeed echo across impossible distances, if consciousness can survive the dissolution of flesh, then maybe Emma's death wasn't the absolute ending he's believed it to be. "You're talking about abandoning everything we've built," Sarah says. "Our careers, our reputations, the rational worldview that's guided every decision we've made for decades. I'm talking about the possibility that what we've built isn't enough." Marcus looks toward the excavation site again, where Astrid waits among the melting permafrost. "Emma died because I exhausted every option medical science could offer, and it still wasn't enough. Maybe there are other kinds of knowledge, other ways to save the people we love." The coffee grows cold in their hands as they contemplate a choice that will either redeem everything Marcus has lost or destroy everything he has left. In the distance, the aurora borealis begins to dance across the horizon like the memory of ancient fires, and Marcus wonders if some decisions are less about courage than about finally accepting the gravitational pull of destiny itself. The aurora borealis fades with the approaching dawn, leaving behind a sky the color of old pewter. Marcus stares out at the excavation site where Astrid waits, and feels the last threads of his old life beginning to fray. Beside him, Sarah clutches her coffee like a talisman against the impossible. "I need to go back out there," he says quietly. "Marcus." Sarah's voice carries 20 years of friendship, 8 years of professional partnership, and the weight of watching him destroy himself after Emma's death. "Think about what you're saying. We could pack up right now, file a standard report about permafrost preservation anomalies, maintain our funding, our reputations, our carefully catalogued lives among the safely dead." The words taste like ash. "Sarah, when Emma was dying, I used to dream about finding some discovery significant enough to ensure her memory would last, some breakthrough that would make her brief life mean something beyond the medical bills and failed treatments." He sets down his coffee with hands that no longer shake. Maybe this is it. Through the shelter's small window, he can see movement at the excavation site. Astrid, walking among their abandoned equipment with the fluid grace of someone who has never doubted her place in the world. Even at this distance, Marcus feels the pull of recognition, the gravitational certainty that his path leads toward her. "The university will crucify us," Sarah says, but her voice has lost its edge of protest. She's already running calculations, Marcus realizes, already weighing the potential for revolutionary discovery against the very real risk of professional suicide. Probably. Marcus begins pulling on his thermal gear with the methodical precision of a man who has made his choice. Miller and Johansson can fly back to Bergen today. Eric, too. Their careers don't need to get tangled up in whatever this becomes. And me? The question hangs between them, like a bridge neither can uncross. Marcus looks at his closest colleague, the woman who held his hand at Emma's funeral when grief made him too dangerous to touch. Sarah Chen, whose brilliant mind and unwavering loyalty have anchored him through 2 decades of academic warfare. "You have more to lose than any of us," he says honestly. "Department chair at Stanford, the Nordstrom Fellowship. Your reputation is stellar, untouchable. You could walk away from this and never look back." Sarah pulls on her own gear in silence, her movements carrying the same methodical precision that has characterized every decision she's made since Marcus first met her. Finally, she looks up with the expression of someone who has just calculated an equation that should be impossible. "Emma asked me to take care of you," she says quietly. "The day before she died, when the morphine wasn't working and she was still trying to protect everyone around her, she made me promise I wouldn't let you disappear into your grief completely." The revelation hits Marcus like a physical blow. Emma, facing her own dissolution with the courage that had defined her brief life, still thinking about others, still trying to weave safety nets for the people she loved. "She'd want you to choose hope," Sarah continues, shouldering her field pack, "even if it means choosing the impossible." The walk back to the excavation site feels different this time, less like a funeral march and more like a pilgrimage. Marcus leads Sarah across the permafrost that has begun its ancient thaw, each step taking him further from the safety of empirical evidence and deeper into a mystery that might destroy everything he's built or reveal truths that could redeem it all. Astrid waits for them beside the ice tomb where they found her, but she's no longer alone. Miller and Johansson stand nearby, their young faces bright with the terrible excitement of those who have decided that career suicide might be worth witnessing something miraculous. Eric hovers at the edge of the group, his weathered features set in the expression of a man honoring obligations older than universities. "We talked," Miller explains as Marcus approaches. "None of us slept, and none of us could live with walking away from this." "You're risking everything," Marcus warns, though he feels a surge of fierce pride at their loyalty. "You risked everything bringing us here in the first place," Johansson counters. "Your theories about Viking settlement patterns were controversial enough, but you believed in them anyway, and you gave us the chance to be part of something significant." Astrid watches this exchange with the patient attention of someone who has observed human nature across centuries. When the team falls silent, she steps forward, and Marcus feels the last of his rational objections crumble under the weight of destiny itself. "Are you ready to remember who you were before grief made you small?" she asks. Marcus looks at his team, his friends, his chosen family, and sees his own desperate hunger for redemption reflected in their faces. Then he looks at Astrid, at the woman who has waited 1,000 years for him to make this choice. Yes, he says, and feels the ordinary world slip away like shed skin. The morning light transforms the excavation site into something that belongs more in ancient sagas than archaeological reports. Astrid moves among their equipment with purposeful grace, touching instruments that respond to her presence in ways that make Marcus's scientific training recoil. Digital displays flicker between readings, electromagnetic sensors emit soft harmonics like distant music, and the ground-penetrating radar traces patterns that resembled runic script more than geological formations. "The tools of your age are crude but eager," Astrid says, her fingers trailing across the thermal imaging device that had first registered her impossible life signs. "They hunger for truth the way scholars do, desperately without fully understanding what they seek." Sarah approaches with her tablet, its screen showing the overnight readings their automated systems had recorded. The electromagnetic variance has increased by 40% since yesterday. "Whatever you are, you're affecting our equipment from 100 meters away." "I am what I have always been," Astrid replies simply. "The question is whether you're prepared to be more than you have been." Miller steps forward, his mathematician's mind clearly wrestling with paradigms that no longer hold. How is any of this possible? Conservation of energy, cellular decay, the basic laws of physics. "Your laws describe the surface of a deep ocean," Astrid interrupts gently. "Useful for navigation, inadequate for exploring the depths. The currents that carry consciousness between lives follow older mathematics." She moves toward the burial site where they'd found her, and Marcus feels compelled to follow. The ice tomb has completely melted now, leaving only a depression in the thawing permafrost and scattered grave goods that gleam like captured starlight. Among them, Marcus notices things that hadn't been there yesterday: carved bone fragments, metal objects that pulse with their own inner warmth, a crystal that seems to contain shifting aurora light. "The first test," Astrid announces, gesturing toward the newly revealed artifacts. "Memory calls to memory. Choose what belongs to the life you've forgotten." The request should seem absurd, but Marcus finds himself drawn toward a leather-wrapped bundle that radiates familiarity. His hands move without conscious direction, unwrapping layers of preserved hide to reveal a collection of manuscript pages covered in runic script. The moment his fingers touch the vellum, images explode through his consciousness. A monastery perched on fjord cliffs. Brother Marcus bent over these same pages by flickering candlelight, translating Latin texts about healing herbs and surgical techniques, the desperate hope that knowledge might be armor against the violence consuming his world. The sound of his own voice reading these words aloud to a young woman with violet eyes who hung on every syllable as if scholarship itself could save her people. "I wrote these," Marcus whispers, "though the revelation should be impossible. I was trying to preserve medical knowledge before the raids reached us." Sarah examines the pages over his shoulder, her face pale with recognition. "Marcus, look at the marginalia. Those notes are in your handwriting. Your actual handwriting, not some medieval approximation." The implications crash over the assembled team like a rogue wave. Miller reaches for a carved wooden astrolabe that begins to sing, literally sing, when he touches it. Harmonics that speak of mathematical relationships between stellar positions and human consciousness. Johansen is drawn to a collection of amber stones that pulse with warm light, each one containing what appears to be a frozen moment of aurora borealis. "This is impossible," she breathes, but her voice carries wonder rather than denial. "These calculations, they're describing thanatological processes I've theorized but never proven. The transition states of consciousness during clinical death." Eric alone refuses to approach the artifacts, though his weathered face shows deep recognition. "My grandfather warned me about the old treasures. He said they choose their holders, and being chosen isn't always a blessing." "Your grandfather was wise," Astrid acknowledges, "but wisdom without courage becomes another form of burial." "Marcus, tell them what you see when you hold your work." Marcus looks down at the manuscripts that feel like extensions of his own hands, at runic texts that he somehow knows describe surgical procedures and pharmaceutical preparations. In the margins, notes in his own handwriting detail observations about anatomy, about the progression of diseases, about desperate attempts to heal what seemed incurable. "I see a man trying to save his daughter," he says quietly. A scholar who believed knowledge could triumph over violence, medicine over fate. "I see myself, but not myself. A life I lived, but never experienced." The parallels are too precise to dismiss. A father watching his child die despite every resource at his disposal. A scholar whose expertise proves inadequate against forces beyond his understanding. A man whose greatest fear is that love itself might not be enough to protect what matters most. "The pattern repeats until we choose to break it," Astrid says, her voice carrying the weight of centuries. "But breaking requires allies, and allies require tests. You've each chosen what calls to your deepest knowledge. Now you must choose whether that knowledge will remain safely academic or become something more dangerous." Marcus looks at his team, at the artifacts that pulse with impossible recognition, at the woman who claims to have waited 1,000 years for this moment. The ordinary world feels increasingly distant, replaced by possibilities that could either redeem everything he's lost or destroy everything he has left. The weight of impossible choice settles over the excavation site like Arctic fog. Marcus clutches the ancient manuscripts against his chest, feeling the phantom memories they carry. Brother Marcus grinding herbs by moonlight, treating wounds that festered despite his careful ministrations, watching helplessly as death claimed those he'd sworn to protect. The parallels to Emma's final months burn like frostbite. "More dangerous how?" Sarah asks, though her voice suggests she already suspects the answer. The amber stones in Johansson's hands pulse brighter, responding to the tension crackling between them. Astrid's violet eyes reflect depths that make the fjord seem shallow. Knowledge that remains theoretical is safe but useless. Applied knowledge transforms both the wielder and the world. What you've touched here remembers not just what was, but what could be. The question is whether you're prepared for consciousness to become currency. Miller's astrolabe continues its haunting song, the carved wood warm against his palms despite the Arctic air. "You're talking about crossing lines that can't be uncrossed. Scientific ethics exist for reasons." "Ethics," Astrid repeats, tasting the word like unfamiliar wine, a luxury of those who haven't watched everything they love consumed by forces they're powerless to change. "Marcus, tell them about the night Emma died." The request hits like a physical blow. Marcus feels his team's attention focus on him with uncomfortable intensity, and for a moment he considers deflecting, maintaining the professional distance that has insulated him from his grief for 2 years. But the manuscripts in his hands pulse with warmth that feels like absolution. "She was in pain," he says quietly. The morphine wasn't working anymore. Her body was shutting down system by system, and modern medicine had exhausted every option. She looked at me that last night and asked why I'd spent my life studying the dead instead of learning how to keep the living alive. The confession hangs in the cold air like visible breath. Marcus has never spoken these words aloud, not to therapists or colleagues, or even to Sarah during the darkest nights after the funeral. But here, surrounded by artifacts that remember impossible things, silence feels more dangerous than truth. "She didn't mean it cruelly," he continues. "Emma was never cruel, even when she was dying. But she was right. I'd built my career on cataloguing what remained after life ended, not on preserving life itself. The irony is that my expertise in ancient burial practices made me exceptionally well qualified to plan her funeral. Johansson's amber stones flare with sympathetic light. My research into consciousness during clinical death, I started it because my brother drowned when we were children. 7 minutes underwater before the paramedics revived him. He described things he couldn't have known, conversations happening in other rooms while he was technically dead. I've spent 15 years trying to prove that consciousness can survive what we think of as death." Miller nods slowly, his astrolabe settling into a lower harmonic that sounds like acknowledgement. Mathematical proofs of multidimensional consciousness transfer. I've been working toward equations that could describe how information persists beyond biological dissolution. My advisor thinks it's career suicide, but the numbers don't lie. And you, Sarah? Astrid's attention turns to the woman who has remained silent, her scientific skepticism warring with loyalty and growing wonder. Sarah looks at each of her colleagues, then at the artifacts that pulse with impossible warmth in the Arctic morning, medical intervention extending life beyond its natural boundaries. I watched Marcus destroy himself trying to save Emma with conventional treatments, and I wondered if there might be other approaches, older ones, the kind that get dismissed as folklore until someone proves them empirically. Eric finally speaks from his position at the edge of their circle, his weathered face grave with inherited knowledge. My grandfather said the old ways never truly died, just went underground, waiting for people desperate enough to pay the prices they demand. Prices, Marcus repeats, feeling the manuscripts grow heavier in his hands. What kind of prices? The currency of transformation, Astrid replies. To change the world, you must first allow the world to change you. The knowledge you've touched remembers how to preserve consciousness beyond death, how to transfer healing across impossible distances, how to break patterns that have repeated for millennia. But using it requires surrendering the safety of ignorance. The team exchanges glances heavy with shared understanding. They've each spent their careers approaching the edges of mysteries that conventional science couldn't explain, theories that tenure committees dismissed, research that branded them as brilliant but dangerously unconventional. We're talking about abandoning everything we've worked for, Sarah says, but her voice lacks conviction. Or finally achieving what we've always worked toward, Marcus counters. The manuscripts pulse against his chest like a second heartbeat. Emma asked me to find something that would make her life matter. Maybe this is it. Maybe the pattern only breaks when we're brave enough to step outside the boundaries we've accepted as absolute. The aurora borealis begins its premature dance across the morning sky, responding to forces that no atmospheric physicist has adequately explained. Marcus looks at his team, at their faces bright with terror and possibility, and realizes they've already chosen. The only question now is whether they're strong enough to survive what comes next. A decision hangs between them like a blade waiting to fall. Marcus feels the ancient manuscripts burning against his ribs, their runic text seeming to shift and pulse in rhythm with his accelerating heartbeat. Around him, his team clutches their impossible artifacts, tools that shouldn't exist, knowledge that defies every principle they've built their careers upon. Then we do it, he says, the words tasting like smoke and copper. Whatever the cost. Astrid nods with the gravity of someone who has witnessed this moment across centuries. The ritual requires 3 elements: memory made manifest, will given form, and sacrifice freely offered. You have chosen your memories. Now you must choose what you're willing to surrender. The temperature drops 20 degrees in an instant, though no wind stirs the Arctic air. Frost begins forming on their equipment, spreading in patterns that look disturbingly like neural networks. The electromagnetic readings on Sarah's tablet spike beyond measurement before the screen goes dark. The conscious mind resists transformation, Astrid explains, her breath visible now despite the morning warmth. It clings to familiar limitations like drowning swimmers clutch debris. To break the pattern that has trapped you both across lifetimes, Marcus must face what he fears most, the moment when knowledge proves insufficient to save what he loves. The excavation site begins to shift around them, reality bending like heated metal. The thawed permafrost ripples, and suddenly Marcus is standing not in modern Norway, but in a torchlit monastery chamber. Stone walls weep with condensation, and the air carries the acrid smell of burning herbs mixed with something else, the sweet rot of infection that no amount of knowledge can cure. His team is still there, but changed. Sarah wears the rough robes of a monastery scribe, her face younger but marked by the same fierce intelligence. Miller has become a young monk whose astronomical calculations cover every available surface in desperate equations. Johansson tends a collection of patients whose symptoms she documents with the same methodical precision she once applied to consciousness research. And there, lying on a crude wooden table, is Emma. But not Emma. A young woman with his daughter's eyes and smile, her Viking dress soaked with blood from wounds that Marcus's medieval knowledge cannot heal. The woman Astrid once was, dying while brother Marcus watches helplessly from across a 1,000-year divide. No, Marcus whispers. But his hands are already moving with remembered skill, grinding herbs that proved useless, applying poultices that couldn't stem the bleeding. Not again. I won't watch her die again. The manuscripts he carries begin to burn, not with fire, but with possibility. The Latin medical texts transform before his eyes, revealing knowledge that shouldn't exist, surgical techniques that won't be invented for centuries, pharmaceutical compounds that could halt infection in its tracks, procedures that could preserve consciousness even as the body fails. But accessing this knowledge requires something he's never been willing to give, not just academic detachment, but the complete surrender of his need to control outcomes, the acceptance that saving someone might require becoming something he no longer recognizes. Choose. Astrid's voice echoes through both timelines simultaneously. Remain brother Marcus, watching safely from the margins while love dies beyond your reach. Or become what the knowledge demands, someone capable of miracles and their consequences. Marcus looks at the dying woman who wears his daughter's face, then at his team whose transformed selves mirror his own desperate expertise. Around them, the monastery walls begin to crack, revealing the modern excavation site beyond like a palimpsest of overlapping realities. The artifacts in his colleagues' hands flare with answering light, but their illumination comes with a price. Miller's astrolabe begins carving equations into his palms, mathematical truths that burn themselves directly into flesh and memory. Johansson's amber stones fuse with her skin, transforming her hands into conduits for consciousness itself. Sarah's transformation is subtler but more profound. Her eyes begin reflecting depths that suggest she's seeing across multiple timelines simultaneously. The knowledge changes you, Astrid warns, her own form shifting between the dying Viking woman and the impossible being who waited a millennium for resurrection. Accept it completely, and you become something beyond human limitation. But refuse it, and watch the pattern repeat until entropy claims everything you've ever loved. Marcus feels the choice tearing him apart. To save the woman dying before him, to break the cycle of helplessness that has defined both his lives, he must surrender his humanity itself, become something that can manipulate the fundamental forces of existence, but lose forever the simple man who once read bedtime stories to a little girl who called him daddy. The manuscripts against his chest pulse with final urgency. Around him, his transformed team waits for his decision, their faces bright with pain and possibility. The dying woman's breath grows shallower with each passing second. Marcus closes his eyes, thinks of Emma asking why he studied death instead of preserving life, and makes the choice that will either damn or redeem them all. He opens the manuscripts and begins to read words that rewrite reality itself. The words that spill from Marcus's lips are not Latin, not runic, but something older, a language that predates human speech, syllables that taste like copper and starlight. The manuscripts in his hands begin to disintegrate as he reads, each phoneme burning through the ancient vellum until only smoke and memory remain. The transformation begins in his throat, a burning that spreads through his vocal cords as the impossible language reshapes the very structure of his larynx. But even as power courses through him, knowledge that could heal any wound, reverse any death, the dying woman before him convulses once and goes still. No, he gasps, dropping the crumbling manuscripts to press his hands against her throat, feeling for a pulse that has already faded. The words of resurrection die on his transformed lips because they've come 30 seconds too late. Again, around him, his team screams in harmonized agony as their own transformations accelerate beyond control. Miller's astrolabe has carved so deep into his palms that Marcus can see bone through the flowing equations. The young monk collapses, his astronomical calculations becoming wounds that map the movement of stars across his flesh in bloody constellations. Johansson's amber stones haven't just fused with her skin, they've begun replacing it entirely, spreading crystalline infection up her arms toward her heart. Her consciousness fragments across multiple states simultaneously, her voice splitting into overlapping harmonics as she experiences every death she's ever studied happening to her own body. "Sarah!" Marcus lunges toward her as she falls, but his transformed hands pass through her like smoke. She's becoming translucent, her ability to see across timelines pulling her consciousness apart until she exists in too many moments to maintain coherence in any of them. Her eyes reflect infinite depths as she whispers, "I can see all the ways this fails, Marcus. Every iteration, every lifetime. We always choose wrong." The monastery around them collapses into temporal fragments. Marcus watches helplessly as centuries of accumulated failure cascade through the disintegrating walls. Every patient brother Marcus couldn't save. Every experiment Dr. Thornfield abandoned. Every night he sat beside Emma's bed knowing his expertise was worthless against the simple fact of mortality. "You were supposed to choose sacrifice." Astrid's voice comes from everywhere and nowhere, tinged now with disappointment that tastes like ash. "But you chose power. The pattern cannot break through force, only through surrender." Marcus feels the knowledge he's absorbed beginning to tear him apart from the inside. Medical techniques that require 6 hands to perform. Surgical procedures that demand he exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Pharmaceutical compounds that need ingredients from timelines that no longer exist. He has become capable of miracles, but every miracle requires resources he cannot access or prices he cannot pay. "I can save her," he insists, even as his enhanced perception shows him the truth. The Viking woman on the table, Emma in her hospital bed, every patient he's ever lost, they all die at exactly the same moment across all possible timelines, because his need to save them is what kills them. His love itself is the poison, his knowledge the wound that won't heal. Miller's transformed body ignites as the stellar equations carved into his flesh achieve critical mass. For one brilliant moment, he exists as a living star chart, his consciousness expanded across galactic distances. Then he burns out like a supernova, leaving only the smell of ozone and the echo of calculations that describe the mathematical impossibility of love conquering entropy. Johansson's crystalline transformation reaches her heart, and she shatters into 1,000 amber fragments that each contain a moment of consciousness perfectly preserved but forever isolated. Her final words scatter across the dimensions. The dead don't want to be saved, they want to be remembered. Sarah's dispersal across timelines accelerates until Marcus can see through her completely. Her voice becomes a whisper from every possible future. The knowledge you seek exists, but using it unmakes everything you're trying to preserve. That's why we always fail, Marcus. The cure is always worse than the disease. Then she's gone, leaving only the faintest impression on reality, a shadow that suggests someone was once there. Marcus kneels alone in the ruins of the monastery that has collapsed back into the modern excavation site. His team is dead, scattered across dimensions and timelines by transformations they couldn't survive. The Viking woman's body has returned to the permafrost, perfectly preserved and perfectly lifeless. Even Astrid has vanished, though her absence feels like a held breath rather than true departure. The manuscripts are ash between his fingers. The artifacts his colleagues held have crumbled to dust. Only Marcus remains, still partially transformed, still carrying knowledge that burns like acid in his enhanced consciousness. He understands now why the pattern repeats. It's not that he lacks the power to save those he loves, it's that his very attempt to save them becomes the force that destroys them. His knowledge, his love, his desperate need to control death itself, these are not solutions but symptoms of the fundamental wound that cannot be healed. Marcus staggers toward the communication equipment, preparing to call for extraction from an excavation that has failed catastrophically. But as his transformed fingers touch the radio, he knows with terrible certainty that he'll return. That somewhere, somewhen, he'll find another woman who needs saving, another daughter who deserves better than death. And he'll fail again, because failure is the only truth his love has ever known. The radio crackles to life under his transformed touch, but instead of the expected static, Marcus hears his own voice speaking words he's never said. "Base camp, this is Dr. Thornfield. The excavation is complete. We found what we were looking for." He jerks his hand back, but the transmission continues. Dozens of versions of himself reporting successful excavations across a cascade of failed timelines. Each voice carries the same exhausted triumph, the same bitter satisfaction of a man who has finally understood the nature of his prison. "You're beginning to see," Astrid's voice whispers from the permafrost where her body lies motionless. Her lips don't move, but her words carry the weight of accumulated centuries. "The pattern isn't about success or failure, Marcus, it's about choice." Marcus turns to face the frozen Viking woman, his enhanced perception showing him the truth that conventional archaeology missed. She isn't preserved by ice, she's preserved by will. Her consciousness exists in the space between death and acceptance, held there by love that refuses to let go. "Emma never asked you to save her," Astrid continues, her voice threading through dimensions of memory. "She asked you to let her matter, but you confused mattering with lasting, significance with permanence." The excavation site begins to shift again, but this time Marcus recognizes the transformation for what it is, not reality bending, but memory finally achieving clarity. He sees the hospital room as it really was, Emma propped against pillows, her face gaunt but eyes bright with the fierce intelligence she inherited from him. "Daddy," she says, her 12-year-old voice carrying wisdom that makes his chest ache. "Why do you study dead things instead of living ones?" "Because the dead have stories to tell," he hears himself answer, the same response he's given 1,000 times. But now he sees what he missed. The flicker of disappointment in her eyes, quickly hidden behind a smile too mature for her age. "But their stories are finished," she replies. "Don't you want to help write new ones?" Marcus feels the transformed knowledge in his mind reshaping itself, equations and formulas and ancient wisdom realigning around a truth so simple, he spent lifetimes running from it. Emma didn't want to be saved. She wanted to be seen, not as a problem to solve or a patient to cure, but as a person whose brief existence had meaning beyond its duration. "I confused love with possession," he whispers to the Arctic air. "I thought saving meant controlling outcomes, but Emma was never mine to save. None of them were." The permafrost beneath Astrid's body begins to crack, but instead of thawing, it reveals depths that contain every grave Marcus has ever excavated, every artifact he's catalogued, every death he's documented. His life's work spreads beneath the ice like a vast necropolis of missed connections, all the moments he chose preservation over presence, analysis over acceptance. Brother Marcus made the same mistake. Astrid's voice grows stronger, though her body remains motionless. "When the raiders came, he tried to hide me instead of letting me fight beside him." Dr. Thornfield repeated the pattern, trying to shield Emma from her own mortality instead of helping her embrace whatever time she had. Marcus sees it now, the hospital room where Emma lay surrounded by machines that extended life without preserving meaning. He remembers her asking to go home, to see the garden one more time, to feed the ducks at the pond behind their house. How he refused because home wasn't sterile enough, safe enough, equipped to monitor every fluctuation in her failing body. She died in that hospital bed, never having said goodbye to the dog who slept in her room, he says, the words cutting through transformed flesh like blades. Never having touched soil with her bare hands one last time. Never having watched stars without fluorescent lights bleeding away their brightness. The knowledge burning in his enhanced consciousness shifts again, revealing procedures not for extending life, but for enriching whatever time remains. Techniques for expanding moments instead of multiplying days. Wisdom that teaches presence instead of permanence. "The pattern breaks," Astrid says, and now her violet eyes open to meet his. "When you choose to honor death instead of denying it. When love becomes about witnessing rather than controlling. Marcus feels the transformations his team underwent, settling into new configurations in his own body. Miller's astronomical equations become tools for measuring significance rather than duration, how brightly a life burns rather than how long. Johansson's consciousness research reveals methods for preserving meaning after memory fades. Sarah's medical expertise transforms into palliative wisdom, the art of making peace with endings. "I can't bring them back," Marcus says, and for the first time in either lifetime, the admission doesn't taste like failure. "No," Astrid agrees, sitting up in her ancient tomb with movements that speak of resurrection without violation of natural law. "But you can choose to remember them as they were instead of mourning them for what they never became." The excavation site stabilizes around them, no longer a temporal battlefield, but simply a place where two people sit surrounded by evidence of lives that mattered despite their brevity. Marcus watches Astrid rise fully from her ancient resting place, permafrost falling away like discarded veils. Her movements carry the fluid grace of someone who has finally awakened from a 1,000-year dream, but her eyes hold depths that speak of accumulated wisdom rather than simple resurrection. "The transformations your colleagues underwent," she says, brushing ice crystals from her Viking dress, "they don't have to end in destruction." Miller's astronomical consciousness, Johansson's crystalline preservation, Sarah's temporal sight. These gifts exist within you now, waiting to be channeled properly. Marcus feels the truth of her words resonating through his enhanced awareness. The knowledge that burned through his team like acid has settled into something more sustainable within his transformed physiology. Miller's equations pulse gently in his temples, no longer carving wounds but mapping possibilities. The crystalline clarity that shattered Johansson flows through his bloodstream like liquid starlight, preserving memories without fossilizing them. "Sarah saw all the ways this could fail," Marcus says, testing his voice against the Arctic silence, "but she also saw the path that leads somewhere else." "She did." Astrid extends her hand to him, and when their fingers touch, Marcus feels Sarah's fragmented consciousness flowing between them like a bridge across dimensions. She scattered herself across timelines not as destruction, but as seeds, every possible future where we might succeed. The excavation site begins to change around them, but this transformation feels different, purposeful rather than chaotic. The permafrost reveals not just Astrid's tomb, but an entire complex preserved beneath the ice, stone chambers filled with artifacts that pulse with the same gentle radiance as the knowledge flowing through Marcus's enhanced awareness. A repository, he breathes, understanding flooding through him, not just of objects, but of choices, every decision that led to love instead of control, presence instead of possession. Astrid leads him through corridors carved from living ice, past chambers that contain more than archaeological treasures. Marcus sees moments preserved like insects in amber, a Viking warrior choosing to sit with his dying enemy instead of claiming victory, a medieval monk abandoning his manuscripts to hold a child's hand through her final fever, a modern doctor stepping away from machines to help a patient watch stars through a hospital window. "The pattern breaks," Astrid explains, her voice echoing through the crystalline halls. "When we choose to serve love, instead of demanding that love serve us. When we become witnesses to meaning, rather than architects of permanence." In the central chamber, Marcus finds them waiting, not his transformed colleagues, but their essential selves, freed from the desperate hunger that destroyed their physical forms. Miller stands before a wall of equations that describe not the mechanics of stellar death, but the mathematics of significance. Each formula shows how moments of connection create resonances that outlast the bodies that generated them. Johansson kneels beside pools of liquid amber that preserve not specimens, but experiences. Her crystalline hands shape the preserved consciousness into forms that can be shared, understood, integrated. "Memory," she says without looking up, "isn't about keeping the dead alive. It's about letting the living learn from what the dead discovered." Sarah exists as a shimmer in the air, her dispersed consciousness finally achieving the coherence it sought. Every timeline where we failed, Her voice comes from everywhere at once, taught her something about the timeline where we might succeed. The knowledge is complete now. We know what needs to be done. Marcus feels the repository's purpose crystallizing in his enhanced understanding. It isn't a tomb or a laboratory or a hospital. It's a school, a place where love learns to serve life instead of enslaving it, where knowledge becomes wisdom through the alchemy of acceptance. "Emma," he whispers, and suddenly she's there, not as the dying child he failed to save, but as the vibrant girl who asked questions that cut straight to the heart of existence. Her presence flows through the chamber like laughter made visible, touching everything with the fierce joy of a life fully lived, despite its brevity. "You don't need to save me, Daddy," she says, her 12-year-old wisdom now freed from the constraints of her failing body. "You need to let me teach you what I learned about living while I had the chance." Around them, the repository comes alive with purpose. The preserved knowledge begins reorganizing itself, not into formulas for extending life, but into techniques for deepening it. Methods for helping people find meaning in whatever time they have. Wisdom for turning endings into completions rather than failures. "We gather strength," Astrid says, her hand warm in his despite centuries of ice, not to fight death, but to serve life more completely. To become guardians of meaning, rather than warriors against mortality. Marcus feels the plan emerging from their combined consciousness like dawn breaking over a long night. They will return to the world above, not as desperate researchers clinging to impossible goals, but as healers equipped with wisdom that honors both living and dying. The pattern finally breaks not through force or knowledge or love alone, but through the courage to let each serve its proper purpose. The repository's ice walls thin to crystal clarity, showing the world beyond where people wait unknowingly for the gifts they're about to receive. The crystal walls dissolve around them like morning frost, and Marcus finds himself standing once again in the mundane excavation site, but everything has changed. The permafrost remains solid beneath his boots, yet he can feel the repository's vast knowledge pulsing just beneath the surface, waiting. Astrid stands beside him, no longer the preserved corpse his team unearthed, but a woman fully awakened to purpose that transcends the boundaries of any single lifetime. "The choice is complete," she says, her breath visible in the Arctic air. "But now comes the harder part, living with what we've learned." Marcus tests his transformed awareness, feeling Miller's astronomical equations flowing through his consciousness, like gentle rivers, rather than burning torrents. The knowledge hasn't diminished. If anything, it has deepened, but it no longer seeks to tear him apart with its impossible demands. Instead, it offers him tools for measuring significance in moments rather than years, for recognizing the stellar brightness of brief connections. "My team," he says, and the words carry both grief and understanding. They had to burn out completely before they could exist in a form that serves instead of consumes. They chose transformation over preservation, Astrid confirms. Just as we must choose action over safety now. The world above needs what we've learned, but bringing this knowledge to the surface means facing those who profit from desperation. Marcus feels Sarah's dispersed consciousness flowing around them like wind carrying warnings. Through her scattered awareness, he sees the pharmaceutical executives who will resist wisdom that values quality over quantity, the medical institutions built on the promise of conquering death rather than honoring life, the grieving families who will demand miracles instead of meaning. The government officials who funded this excavation, he realizes, watching possible futures unfold through Sarah's temporal sight, they're expecting weapons against mortality. Archaeological discoveries that can be monetized, preserved specimens that can be studied indefinitely. When we return with wisdom instead of artifacts, they will try to stop us, Astrid finishes. They will brand us as dangerous, delusional, contaminated by whatever we found in the ice. The final confrontation isn't with death, Marcus, it's with those who profit from the fear of death. Marcus feels Emma's presence flowing through his enhanced awareness, her 12-year-old wisdom now integrated into every decision he makes. She shows him hospitals where children like her lie surrounded by machines that extend suffering instead of preserving joy, research facilities where scientists chase immortality while ignoring the meaning already present in mortal lives. The pattern repeats in every generation, he understands, because institutions preserve themselves by perpetuating the problems they claim to solve. We're not just choosing to break our own cycle, we're choosing to disrupt theirs. Johansson's crystalline consciousness surfaces in his awareness, offering preserved memories of every time knowledge has threatened established power. Scientists silenced for discoveries that challenged profitable paradigms, doctors discredited for choosing presence over procedure, researchers destroyed for valuing wisdom over wealth. But this time is different, Marcus says, feeling the certainty settle into his transformed bones. This time we carry the combined knowledge of every failure, every lesson learned across lifetimes of trying. We know their strategies because we've faced them before. The excavation equipment around them begins responding to their enhanced presence, instruments recalibrating themselves to measure significance rather than mere data. Marcus watches his computers reorganize their files, archaeological records transforming into case studies of meaningful connection, medical databases becoming repositories of palliative wisdom. "The radio," Astrid says, pointing to the communication device that still crackles with echoes of his various selves across failed timelines. "It's time to call them, time to announce what we've really found here." Marcus approaches the radio with steady hands, feeling the weight of choice settling around him like armor. Through Sarah's temporal awareness, he can see the cascade of consequences that will follow this moment. Government agents dispatched to contain them, media campaigns designed to discredit their findings, institutional pressure applied to every hospital and university that might consider implementing their methods. "Dr. Thornfield to base camp," he says into the microphone, his voice carrying the authority of accumulated lifetimes. "The excavation has yielded significant findings. We're returning with materials that require immediate integration into current medical and psychological protocols." Astrid's hand finds his shoulder as they wait for the response, her touch anchoring him to the present moment while his enhanced awareness spans across possible futures. In the distance, he can hear helicopters beginning their approach. Whether for rescue or containment, only their choices in the coming hours will determine. Whatever happens next, Emma's voice whispers through dimensions of memory. "Remember that the goal isn't to save everyone from death. It's to help everyone find meaning before death finds them." Marcus squares his shoulders against the Arctic wind, feeling the repository's wisdom flowing through him like liquid starlight. The real battle is about to begin. The helicopters arrive like mechanical vultures against the pale Arctic sky, their rotors churning permafrost into swirling clouds that obscure everything except the deliberate precision of their landing. Marcus counts 3 aircraft, too many for a simple extraction, too few for a full military operation. The careful calculation of a response team that expects resistance but doesn't want to acknowledge it officially. Dr. Thornfield. The lead agent emerges from the central helicopter, his black thermal suit marking him as government rather than academic. Behind him, Marcus recognizes Dr. Elizabeth Kane from the Norwegian Institute of Genetic Research, her presence confirming his worst suspicions about what they believe he's found. "I'm Agent Morrison, Pandemic Containment Protocol. We're here to secure any biological materials that may pose a public health risk." Marcus feels the repository's knowledge flowing through his enhanced consciousness, showing him exactly what script they're following. Biological contamination provides legal justification for seizure without requiring explanation. Public health emergency allows them to classify findings indefinitely, the same playbook they've used to bury every discovery that threatens established paradigms. "There's no contamination," he says calmly, aware of Astrid standing just behind him, her Viking dress somehow invisible to their instruments and recording devices. Sarah's temporal awareness shows him the strange blind spot they exist within, perception editing itself around truths the observers aren't prepared to process. "That's not for you to determine." Dr. Kane steps forward, her scanner already detecting anomalies it can't categorize. Your radio transmissions mentioned materials requiring immediate medical integration. That suggests active biological agents, possibly prehistoric pathogens released by the permafrost melt. Marcus watches her device struggle to process the readings it's getting from his transformed physiology. The numbers keep shifting, cellular activity that registers as both ancient and impossibly vital, genetic markers that suggest exposure to unknown evolutionary pressures. Through Miller's integrated astronomical consciousness, he sees how they interpret the data: alien influences, temporal contamination, biological warfare applications. You're going to try to weaponize this, he realizes, the certainty flowing through him like ice water. Turn wisdom into biological enhancement programs, transform healing into military advantage, extract what you can use and destroy what you can't control. Agent Morrison's hand moves toward his sidearm, not drawing but establishing position. Dr. Thornfield, you've been isolated in extreme conditions for weeks. Exposure to unknown biological agents can cause hallucinations, paranoia, compromised judgment. We're here to help. Behind them, more figures emerge from the helicopters. Military scientists with containment equipment, psychiatric specialists prepared to declare him unfit for decision-making, legal observers ready to process whatever paperwork removes him from the equation. Marcus feels the net closing around them with institutional precision. The knowledge can't be contained. Astrid's voice flows through his consciousness, still invisible to their perception but perfectly clear to him. It exists now in too many forms, across too many dimensions of possibility, but they'll try to cage what they can capture. Through Johansson's crystalline awareness, Marcus sees their real objective. They don't want to suppress his discoveries. They want to control their distribution, patent the techniques, license the wisdom, transform healing into profit centers that serve institutional power rather than human need. The same pattern that turns medicine into merchandise and education into indoctrination. The materials we've developed, Marcus says carefully, they only work when applied with proper understanding. Try to extract them through force, and you'll get nothing but data that destroys rather than heals. Dr. Kane's scanner begins registering dangerous fluctuations as his enhanced physiology responds to the threat around them. The readings show cellular activity that shouldn't be possible, genetic expressions that suggest exposure to evolutionary pressures spanning millennia, biological markers indicating consciousness operating across multiple dimensional frameworks. Isolate him now, she orders, but her voice carries uncertainty. These readings, they're not matching any known pathogen profiles. His cellular structure appears to be integrating information at rates that should cause immediate systemic failure. Marcus feels Emma's presence flowing through the situation like sunlight cutting through storm clouds. Her 12-year-old wisdom shows him the choice point approaching, the moment where they must decide whether to resist with force or transform resistance itself into something their opponents can't process. You want to know what we found? He says, stepping forward as containment specialists raise their equipment. We found the cure for the only disease that really matters. We learned how to choose meaning over duration, presence over preservation, love that serves life instead of enslaving it. Agent Morrison signals his team to advance, but something in Marcus's words stops them. Perhaps it's the absolute certainty in his voice, or the way their instruments keep malfunctioning in his presence, or the growing awareness that they're confronting something their protocols never anticipated. The test isn't whether we can escape. Astrid's consciousness flows through his awareness. It's whether we can transform this confrontation into the first lesson. Everything we've learned, everything we've become, this is where it begins serving the world. Marcus spreads his hands, offering no resistance as the containment team approaches, feeling the repository's infinite wisdom preparing to meet institutional power with something it has never encountered, absolute fearless compassion armed with the truth. The containment team freezes mid-step, as Marcus's words hit them with unexpected force. Agent Morrison's hand hovers over his weapon, but his training offers no protocol for this. A target who radiates dangerous knowledge while offering complete surrender, whose very presence makes their instruments scream warnings about impossible biological readings. Stand down, Morrison barks, but his voice carries uncertainty. Dr. Kane's scanner shows Marcus's cellular activity spiking beyond all known parameters, yet he appears completely calm, almost luminous against the Arctic landscape. "You think you're containing a contamination," Marcus says, his voice carrying harmonics that seem to resonate in their bones. "But you can't isolate wisdom, Agent Morrison. You can't quarantine understanding." Through Sarah's temporal awareness, Marcus sees the critical moment approaching, the choice that will determine whether this confrontation becomes another cycle of institutional suppression or the beginning of something unprecedented. Emma's presence flows through his consciousness like starlight, her 12-year-old clarity showing him the path forward. "Dr. Thornfield." Dr. Kane steps closer, her scanner registering readings that violate everything she knows about human biology. "What exactly did you find down there?" Marcus feels the repository's knowledge surging through him as he recognizes her genuine scientific curiosity beneath the institutional protocols. Here, she's the key. A researcher still capable of choosing truth over career, discovery over control. "We found the cure for meaninglessness," he says, directing his words specifically to her. "The antidote for the fear that drives people to choose existence over life, duration over depth. Your scanners are detecting the biological signatures of someone who has learned to live without the terror of death." The readings on her device fluctuate wildly as Marcus allows his transformed physiology to become fully visible to their instruments. Cellular regeneration patterns that suggest centuries of accumulated vitality, genetic expressions indicating exposure to evolutionary pressures spanning multiple lifetimes, neurological activity that bridges individual consciousness with something vast and interconnected. "Impossible," Dr. Kane whispers, but her scientific mind is already processing implications. These readings suggest biological integration with quantum temporal phenomena. Consciousness, operating across dimensional frameworks that shouldn't be accessible to human neurology. Agent Morrison moves to shut down her scanner, recognizing the threat of her fascination, but Marcus steps between them. As he does, the permafrost beneath their feet begins resonating with harmonics that make their equipment malfunction in cascading waves. "The knowledge wants to be shared," Marcus explains as their containment devices fail one by one. "It exists to serve life, not institutional power. Try to cage it, and it simply flows around your barriers." Through Miller's astronomical consciousness, Marcus shows them visions of stellar birth, how stars transform cosmic dust into light through the alchemy of willing combustion. Through Johansson's crystalline awareness, he shares the mathematics of preservation that honors essence rather than form. Through Sarah's temporal sight, he lets them glimpse the infinite variations where this same confrontation played out, each iteration teaching them more about the courage required to serve truth over authority. "What are you doing to them?" Morrison demands, watching his team members lower their weapons with expressions of dawning wonder. Their faces reflect the same transformation Marcus witnessed in his own team, the shift from desperate acquisition to profound understanding. "I'm showing them what they came here to find," Marcus replies, feeling Astrid's presence flowing through the confrontation, like an Arctic wind that carries the scent of spring. "You wanted biological enhancement? Here it is, the enhancement of choosing meaning over fear, connection over control, service over self-preservation." Dr. Kane drops her scanner entirely as the readings become too profound to process through mechanical instruments. "The cellular regeneration patterns," she breathes, "they're not extending life, they're intensifying it. Biological optimization for depth rather than duration." Marcus sees the moment of choice crystallizing around them. Morrison reaches for his radio to call for backup, but his team members are already transforming, their institutional programming dissolving as they encounter wisdom their training never prepared them to resist. "The confrontation isn't between us and you," Marcus realizes, Emma's voice flowing through his words. "It's between the part of you that serves power and the part that serves truth, between the agents following orders and the human beings capable of choosing wonder over fear." The permafrost beneath them begins glowing with subtle luminescence as the repository's influence reaches toward the surface, offering its gifts not through force but through irresistible invitation. Marcus watches as even Morrison's rigid certainty begins cracking, institutional armor proving inadequate against absolute compassionate truth. This is where it begins. Astrid's consciousness flows through the Arctic air, not with escape or resistance, but with transformation spreading from person to person, choice by choice, until the very institutions that came to contain us become vehicles for the healing the world needs. Marcus spreads his arms wider, embracing both the approaching reinforcements he can hear in the distance and the growing circle of transformed understanding surrounding him, ready for whatever comes next. The reinforcements arrive like a steel storm, 6 helicopters this time, disgorging tactical units with equipment designed for containing threats beyond normal protocol. Marcus watches Agent Morrison's superior emerge from the lead aircraft, a woman whose very presence radiates institutional authority sharpened to a killing edge. Director Walsh, Morrison reports, his voice tight with confusion. The situation has evolved beyond standard parameters. Marcus feels the moment crystallizing around them with terrible clarity. Through Sarah's temporal awareness, he sees the cascade of consequences flowing from this instant. If Walsh follows protocol, she'll authorize lethal force to prevent whatever they perceive as contamination from spreading. If she doesn't, her own superiors will view her as compromised, another casualty of the anomaly requiring elimination. Dr. Thornfield, Director Walsh, approaches with calculated precision, her scanner already processing the impossible readings emanating from his transformed physiology. Satellite monitoring detected energy signatures from this location that matched no known phenomenon. Biological agents with potential planetary impact require immediate containment. Marcus feels the repository's wisdom flowing through him as he recognizes the choice point approaching. Through Emma's 12-year-old clarity, he sees the price of the transformation they've achieved. The knowledge can spread, can heal, can serve, but only if someone is willing to pay the cost of anchoring it in this reality. "You're right," he says, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated lifetimes. "This does have planetary impact, but not the kind your protocols are designed to contain." Astrid's presence flows through his consciousness, like Arctic wind carrying the scent of spring. Through their shared awareness, he feels her understanding of what must come next. The Viking raids that killed her 1,000 years ago, the genetic disease that claimed Emma, the failed relationships that destroyed his colleagues, all variations of the same pattern where love tries to preserve what was meant to be transformed. "The readings we're detecting," Dr. Kane says, her scientific curiosity overriding institutional caution, they suggest consciousness operating across multiple dimensional frameworks. Biological integration with quantum temporal phenomena that shouldn't be possible. Director Walsh signals her tactical team to establish containment positions. "Dr. Kane, step away from the subject. These readings could indicate exposure to extraterrestrial biological agents, temporal contamination, or weaponized consciousness modification." Marcus feels the net closing around them with lethal precision, but through Miller's astronomical consciousness, he sees the deeper pattern. Stars die to birth new stars. Organic matter decomposes to nourish soil. Love sacrifices preservation to serve transformation. The universe operates through willing surrender of what was to enable what could be. "The knowledge can't be destroyed," he says, feeling the truth settle into his bones like starlight. "But it can be anchored. Someone can choose to embody it so completely that it becomes permanent part of reality's fabric." Through Johansson's crystalline awareness, he understands the mathematics of the choice approaching. The repository's wisdom has been preserved across millennia by consciousness willing to merge completely with its essence. Not preservation of individual identity, but transformation of self into pure service. Marcus, Astrid's voice carries centuries of love across dimensional barriers. "You don't have to—" "Yes, I do," he interrupts, feeling Emma's presence flowing through his words like liquid light. "This is why we kept failing. We kept trying to preserve what we loved instead of trusting it to become what it was meant to be." Director Walsh raises her weapon as Marcus steps toward the excavation site, her training recognizing the moment when containment becomes impossible. Final warning, Dr. Thornfield. Stand down immediately. Marcus feels the repository calling to him from beneath the permafrost, offering complete integration with its infinite wisdom. He can become a permanent bridge between dimensions, anchor the knowledge so deeply in reality that no institutional power can suppress it. The cost, dissolution of everything he has been to serve everything he could become. The sacrifice isn't death, he realizes, Emma's wisdom flowing through his understanding. It's choosing to love something more than your own existence, choosing to serve truth more than survival. The permafrost beneath his feet begins glowing with increasing intensity as Marcus opens himself completely to the repository's embrace. He feels his individual consciousness expanding, merging with the accumulated wisdom of everyone who has ever chosen meaning over preservation. Through the transformation, he senses Director Walsh's finger tightening on the trigger. Her institutional programming demanding she prevent whatever is occurring. But her bullets will pass through only empty space, because Marcus is already becoming something beyond physical form, pure, compassionate intelligence anchored in reality's deepest structures. Tell them. His voice echoes across dimensions as his body dissolves into luminous possibility, that the cure for meaninglessness is available in every moment where someone chooses love over fear. The repository isn't a place, it's a choice. Astrid's tears fall like blessing rain onto permafrost that now glows with permanent starlight, marking the spot where knowledge took root in reality so deeply that it can never again be contained or destroyed. The luminous permafrost pulsed with gentle radiance where Marcus had stood moments before, and the sudden silence felt more profound than any explosion. Director Walsh's weapon remained trained on empty air, her finger still poised on a trigger that no longer served any purpose. The tactical teams held their positions like statues, their containment protocols rendered meaningless by a target that had transcended the very concept of physical capture. Dr. Kane dropped to her knees beside the glowing ice, her scanner forgotten as she reached toward the light with trembling fingers. "The energy signatures," she whispered, her voice breaking with scientific wonder and human grief. "They're not diminishing. They're stabilizing, integrating with the quantum substrate itself." Astrid materialized fully in the aftermath, no longer flickering between dimensions but standing solid and radiant on the frozen ground. Her violet eyes reflected the starlight emanating from the permafrost as she faced the assembled forces with absolute fearlessness. "He succeeded," she said, her voice carrying the weight of both loss and triumph. "The knowledge is anchored now. It can't be extracted or contained because it's become part of reality's foundation." Director Walsh lowered her weapon slowly, her institutional training struggling to process what she had witnessed. Her scanners showed energy readings that defied classification. Not biological contamination or foreign technology, but something that registered as pure, organized information embedded in the fabric of space-time itself. "What exactly was Dr. Thornfield?" she asked, her voice stripped of its earlier authority. "A bridge," Astrid replied, kneeling to place her palm against the glowing ice. "Someone willing to transform love into service instead of possession. The repository needed an anchor in this reality, and he chose to become that anchor permanently." Agent Morrison approached cautiously, his team following with weapons lowered but ready. "Ma'am, how do we contain this? The energy readings are spreading through the permafrost in expanding patterns. Whatever he did, it's not staying localized." Through the enhanced awareness Marcus's sacrifice had gifted her, Astrid could feel his consciousness dispersing through dimensional layers like light through a prism. He existed now as pure compassionate intelligence, accessible to anyone willing to choose meaning over preservation, service over survival. The repository's wisdom flowed through him into reality's deepest structures, becoming available not just to archaeologists or scientists, but to anyone facing the fundamental choice between love and fear. "You can't contain wisdom," Dr. Kane said, rising from the glowing permafrost with tears freezing on her cheeks. "You can only choose whether to receive it or resist it." The tactical teams exchanged uncertain glances as their equipment registered impossible readings. The permafrost beneath their feet hummed with harmonics that seemed to resonate in their bones, carrying whispers of knowledge their minds couldn't quite grasp, but their hearts recognized as truth. Sarah emerged from the excavation site, her temporal awareness showing the ripple effects spreading outward from this moment. "It's not just here," she said, pointing toward the horizon where aurora lights danced in patterns that shouldn't occur at this latitude. "The transformation is cascading through the planet's electromagnetic field. Every archaeological site, every place where ancient wisdom was preserved, they're all awakening simultaneously." Director Walsh felt her certainty crumbling as she watched her containment operation transform into something beyond her training to comprehend. The man they'd come to capture had voluntarily dissolved into pure service, and the very attempt to cage his discoveries had instead catalyzed their permanent integration with planetary consciousness. "The mission parameters," Morrison said quietly, "they don't account for this scenario. How do we report that the subject chose to become metaphysical infrastructure?" Astrid stood, her presence radiating the same luminous certainty Marcus had carried in his final moments. "You report that humanity found the cure for its deepest disease," she said, addressing Director Walsh directly. "The terror of meaninglessness that drives people to choose survival over significance, preservation over transformation." Miller and Johansson emerged from their equipment shelters, their enhanced awareness allowing them to perceive Marcus's continued existence across dimensional boundaries. He wasn't gone. He had become something larger, more fundamental. Every choice made with love instead of fear would strengthen his anchoring presence. Every act of service over self-preservation would deepen the repository's integration with reality. "The readings are stabilizing at levels that suggest permanent integration," Dr. Kane reported, her scientific mind struggling to process data that transcended purely physical metrics. "Whatever Dr. Thornfield became, it's not temporary. This transformation appears to be eternal." The glowing permafrost pulsed once more, and for an instant, everyone present felt Marcus's consciousness touch theirs with infinite gentleness. Not communication through words, but direct transmission of understanding that love's true power lies not in preserving what was, but in serving what could be. Director Walsh holstered her weapon, recognizing finally that the mission had transformed beyond anything protocols could address. They had come to contain a discovery, but instead had witnessed the birth of something that would change the fundamental nature of human consciousness itself. The aurora-lit silence stretched across the excavation site like a held breath, broken only by the distant hum of helicopter rotors and the soft crystalline chiming that seemed to emanate from the permafrost itself. Director Walsh stood frozen, her holstered weapon suddenly feeling heavier than the weight of protocol that had governed her entire career. Around her, tactical teams lowered their equipment with expressions of profound bewilderment, as if waking from a dream they couldn't quite remember but couldn't bear to forget. Then the glowing ice began to shift, not cracking or melting, but reshaping itself with fluid grace, the luminous permafrost swirling upward in spirals of light that coalesced into a familiar form. Marcus materialized gradually, like a photograph developing in reverse, his physical body reconstructing itself from pure radiant energy. But when his feet touched solid ground and his eyes opened, everyone present could see immediately that something fundamental had changed. His gaze held depths that hadn't existed before, not just the accumulated wisdom of the repository, but the profound peace of someone who had willingly surrendered everything and found himself returned with interest. The desperate grief that had driven his obsession with preservation was gone, replaced by a luminous certainty that pulsed in rhythm with the transformed permafrost beneath their feet. "Marcus," Dr. Kane whispered, her scientific instruments registering readings that suggested he was simultaneously completely human and something far beyond normal biological parameters. He turned toward her with a smile that carried starlight. "I'm here," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated in dimensions their equipment couldn't measure. "But I'm also everywhere the choice between love and fear is being made. The repository didn't require permanent sacrifice. It required permanent commitment. Astrid approached him with tears streaming down her face, her violet eyes reflecting the aurora patterns that now danced across his skin. "I thought I'd lost you again," she breathed, reaching toward him with trembling fingers. "Never again," Marcus replied, taking her hand in his. Where their skin touched, the air itself seemed to sing with harmonics of reunion that transcended lifetimes. "The pattern is finally complete. No more failing to save what we love, because we're too afraid to let it transform." Director Walsh found herself stepping forward, despite every protocol demanding she maintain distance from an anomalous subject. "Dr. Thornfield, you were gone. Our instruments registered complete dissolution of biological matter." "I was integrated," Marcus corrected gently, his transformed awareness allowing him to perceive the fear beneath her institutional authority. "The repository doesn't destroy consciousness. It reveals what consciousness actually is when it stops clinging to survival and chooses service instead." Agent Morrison gestured helplessly at his malfunctioning scanners. "Sir, how do we classify this in our reports? You technically died, and then reconstituted from energy patterns that shouldn't be able to support biological life." Marcus felt laughter bubbling up from depths he'd never accessed before. Not the desperate humor of someone avoiding pain, but the joy of someone who had touched the universe's deepest joke and found it luminously kind. "You classify it as graduation," he said. "Humanity's first successful transformation of institutional preservation into collaborative service." Through his expanded awareness, he could feel the ripple effects spreading outward from their location. Archaeological sites across the planet were awakening as the repository's wisdom flowed through dimensional channels his sacrifice had opened permanently. Ancient knowledge was becoming available not just to scholars and scientists, but to anyone willing to choose meaning over meaninglessness, connection over control. "The readings are unlike anything in our databases," Dr. Kane reported, her voice filled with wonder rather than alarm. "You're registering as fully human, but with quantum coherence patterns that suggest consciousness operating across multiple dimensional frameworks simultaneously." "The enhancement we were searching for," Marcus said, looking directly at Director Walsh. "Not biological immortality or technological superiority, but the ability to choose love even when fear seems safer, the courage to serve truth even when institutions demand conformity." Sarah approached with her equipment, showing temporal stabilization readings that defied conventional physics. "The time distortions have resolved," she said. "Past and present are aligned now. The loop is finally complete." Marcus felt Emma's presence flowing through his transformed awareness, not as memory or regret, but as pure love that had learned to express itself through service rather than desperate preservation. She existed now as part of the repository's wisdom, her 12-year-old clarity helping anchor compassionate intelligence in reality's deepest structures. "The mission is complete," he said, addressing the assembled forces with gentle authority that made their weapons feel suddenly obsolete. Not containment or extraction, but integration. The repository's gifts are available now to anyone willing to receive them. Director Walsh looked around at her tactical teams, seeing the same transformation in their faces that had overtaken Morrison's unit. Fear-based protocols dissolving into wonder-based curiosity, institutional programming, giving way to collaborative service. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice stripped of its earlier edge. Marcus smiled, feeling Astrid's hand warm in his as aurora light danced across the transformed permafrost. "Now we go home," he said. "But we go as bridges between what was and what could be, carrying the repository's wisdom into a world ready to remember that love's true power lies not in preserving what we cherish, but in trusting it to become everything it was meant to be, the new beginning." 6 months later, Marcus stood in the sunlit courtyard of the newly established Institute for Consciousness Studies in Oslo, watching children from the local school explore the garden, where ancient runestones had been carefully integrated with modern botanical displays. Their laughter carried on spring air that still held traces of winter's bite, and he marveled at how easily they accepted the stone's gentle luminescence, as if glowing archaeological artifacts were the most natural thing in the world. "Dr. Thornfield?" A young girl with braided blonde hair tugged at his sleeve. her eyes bright with curiosity. "My teacher says these stones remember stories. Can you teach me how to listen?" Marcus knelt to her level, feeling the familiar warmth that had replaced his old desperate need to preserve innocence at any cost. Through his transformed awareness, he could sense the repository's wisdom flowing gently through the courtyard, available to anyone with the openness to receive it. "Close your eyes," he said softly, "and instead of trying to hear with your ears, try listening with your heart." The girl's face scrunched in concentration, then bloomed with wonder as the stone's harmonics reached her consciousness. "Oh," she gasped. "They're singing about people who loved each other so much. They found ways to be together across forever." "That's exactly right," Marcus smiled, glancing toward the Institute's main building where Astrid was visible through the large windows, leading a discussion group of archaeologists, physicists, and philosophers who had traveled from around the world to study the phenomenon that had become known as consciousness archaeology. The transition hadn't been seamless. Government agencies had initially struggled with the impossibility of containing or controlling discoveries that existed as much in the realm of human awareness as physical reality. Director Walsh, now serving as liaison between various international research committees, had been forced to develop entirely new frameworks for documenting phenomena that transcended traditional scientific categories. But resistance had gradually given way to collaboration as the benefits became undeniable. Archaeological sites worldwide were yielding insights that bridged gaps between ancient wisdom and modern understanding. Medical researchers were discovering healing modalities that worked through consciousness as much as chemistry. Environmental scientists were finding solutions that emerged from humanity's capacity to see itself as part of larger living systems rather than separate from them. "Marcus?" Dr. Kane approached across the courtyard, her tablet displaying data streams that still made her shake her head in bemused wonder. "The latest readings from the Peru site are showing the same integration patterns we documented here. Whatever you anchored 6 months ago, it's continuing to spread through connection points across the planet." Marcus rose, his hand briefly touching the child's shoulder in benediction before she scampered back to her classmates. "Not spreading," he corrected gently. "Awakening. The capacity was always there, dormant in places where love had been chosen over fear strongly enough to leave permanent impressions." Through the Institute's windows, he could see Astrid gesturing animatedly as she described dimensional theory to the assembled researchers. Her violet eyes caught the afternoon light as she looked toward the courtyard, and their gaze met across the distance with the same electric recognition that had first sparked in the ice caves. But now that recognition carried no desperate urgency, no fear of loss, only the deep joy of two consciousnesses that had finally learned to trust love's capacity for transformation. "The Chinese delegation arrives next week," Dr. Kane continued, scrolling through her schedule. "They've documented similar phenomena at 3 separate archaeological sites and want to establish formal research partnerships. It's unprecedented, international cooperation based not on competition for resources, but genuine curiosity about consciousness itself." Marcus nodded, feeling Emma's presence like a gentle current of approval flowing through his awareness. His daughter's wisdom had become part of the repository's gift to humanity, her 12-year-old understanding that love means helping others become their fullest selves rather than keeping them safely small. Through the Institute's work, that understanding was taking root in minds across the planet, one choice at a time. Agent Morrison appeared at the courtyard entrance, no longer in tactical gear but wearing the simple clothes of someone who had traded institutional authority for collaborative service. "Dr. Thornfield? There's someone here to see you. Says she's been having dreams about ancient Egypt and needs to understand what they mean." "Send her to the consultation room," Marcus replied, recognizing the pattern he'd come to know well. The repository's wisdom called to those ready to remember that consciousness wasn't confined to single lifetimes, that love's lessons often required multiple incarnations to fully integrate. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Marcus felt the profound satisfaction of someone who had finally discovered his true work. Not preserving the past against the future's uncertainty, but serving as a bridge between what was and what could be. The desperate archaeologist who had kissed a frozen corpse in a moment of grief-fueled madness was gone, transformed into something far more useful, a guardian of humanity's remembering. The aurora lights began their early dance across the Oslo sky, and Marcus smiled, knowing that somewhere in the luminous patterns, love was writing its eternal story across the cosmos, one willing consciousness at a time.